welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I am your host, Jay Hrcsko, and we're talking Game of Frameworks again. So unless you've been living under a rock, you probably have seen that we just completed a series on all of these scaling frameworks. And what this episode is we are going to go back through the series itself. I invited a couple of our listeners, a couple of our avid listeners, I should say. We'll introduce them in a moment. And my fellow board member, Andrew Leff. Say hello, Andrew.
Hello, Andrew.
To discuss the series itself. So what did we learn? What were we surprised by? How familiar were we beforehand? And then how familiar are we afterwards? And then we're going to just do some general spitballing and observation around what we see, explaining some of the trends we see in the industry regarding frameworks, why some are used more than others, and maybe what the future beholds from a practitioner perspective. As you may remember, we spoke to a bunch of people from different scaling frameworks. Some were founders, some were practitioners, some were instructors, some were even trainers, and even fellows and stuff of that nature. So now we're going to talk about from the end practitioner result, what are people thinking and what have we noticed? So first I'm going to introduce Ben. Ben, why don't you give everybody, just introduce yourself and just give them a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Ben. I've been an Agilist in some form or another pretty much my whole career. It just sort of happened that way. And I've been with a handful of companies in the U.S. and the U.K., all very varied context and situations. And in terms of the scaling stuff and these frameworks, I've got the most familiarity with SAFe, a little bit with less as well, not as much. But I've been in contexts where it's been a bit more of like a, treat all these things like tools in a toolbox type situation. So it was really interesting listening to all this and hearing about kind of the pure form of each one. So I'm looking forward to getting into more of it with you guys.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And Mike, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. My name's Mike. I've been helping companies do awesome things with software for more years than I care to admit. So much so that I recall being paid to write COBOL code on punch cards and have done just about everything in the software world that there is, and developer, analyst, manager, tester, development manager. And in the Agile space, a little more than 10 years. Practically speaking, I've done more in SAFe environments than others, and greatly enjoyed the Game of Frameworks, and excited to tear it apart a little bit more.
All right. Thank you, Mike. So Ben alluded to it a bit, and then Mike, you just covered it. So Andrew, for our listeners that may or may not know, how familiar are you with some of the frameworks? I know you and I have talked about SAFe ad nauseum. Have you ever done anything with any of the other frameworks?
I've done a little bit with less. I've done a little bit with DAD, but never actually implemented it. Worked on some strategy for some companies. That's pretty much it, besides deep, lots of experience with SAFe. So yeah, I am finding less about, or I shouldn't even say less organizations are, they seem to be going pure anything. It's always a mishmash of everything. So.
Right. And as for myself, for you listeners, in case you didn't catch it or you missed a previous episode, I have only done SAFe in practice. I have no experience with any of the other frameworks on a practical level. I have taken a course in Discipline Agile, which we'll touch on when we get to DAD. But I literally went into this blind with no experience. So it was pretty eye-opening for me. It sounds like Ben and Mike had the same experience, and even you, Andrew. So let's dig in. So I'm going to go in order of the order that we released the episodes. And the first one I'm going to start with Nexus. And Mike, I'm going to start with you. So how familiar were you with Nexus beforehand? What did you learn? What surprised you? What were your thoughts after getting through that episode?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, heard of it. Had no practical experience and had not done any real study on it. So it was pretty much just new to the details. What I learned, what stuck out at me was it's the concept of multiple teams working from a single backlog, which makes a lot of sense. Great use case. I've done that a couple of times. Other things I learned, the statistics about 2/3 of the stuff we build is waste. I mean, I kind of felt that, but the way it was explained was pretty interesting. There was nothing about Nexus that was a surprise per se. Some things that really resonated for me, though, was the bottom-up intelligence is getting lost. That I heard that and I thought, wow, I know exactly what they're talking about. I can see that happening. And other thing that resonated really for me was the emphasis on simplicity and common sense.
It's funny you hit on the bottom-up intelligence, because that was one of the things that I actually wrote down during the conversation about how that was the exact quote from Patricia's bottom-up intelligence is getting lost. So it's very, very observant. How about you, Ben? What did you pick up on?
So I didn't have any experience in Nexus either. When I saw the first episode, I thought we were talking about a phone or a tablet or something like that. I didn't really know that it was a scaling framework. But the thing that seemed really appealing about it to me was that I thought it was quoted in that one that, if you understand Scrum or basic Scrum, then you pretty much understand Nexus. And I was also a little bit surprised because I feel like a lot of these frameworks sort of, they market kind of unlimited ballooning potential of how big you can scale. Whereas Nexus seemed to kind of max out around pretty much a number of teams similar to, an ideal team size of 3 to 9. So to that end, I look at a lot of these and I keep trying to look for the commonality in them. And there's always like a certain level where, that's sort of the first cut of scaling. And then you got to kind of figure what's the next thing out. And so this one, it seems like that 3 to 9 team span. And then that's Nexus. So I found that quite interesting. And I don't mean this in an insulting way at all, but it seemed like because of that, it seemed kind of more basic than some of the other stuff that was gone through on the series.
And I don't think they would, based upon the conversation I had with Patricia and Kurt, I don't think they would view that as insulting at all, because I think that was the intent behind Nexus, because I actually took a quote down when during the interview, and I think it was Kurt that said, quote, "It has to be dirt simple." And I think that's where they were trying to go, because it does make sense. Why overcomplicate it, right? Which we'll get to as the conversation obviously goes on tonight. We're going to get to the more complicated, almost prescriptive types of frameworks. But I thought that was very, very telling. I wanted to know, did either of you pick up on one of the features that Patricia and Kurt both said made Nexus unique, which I thought was an intriguing idea, was the idea of the Nexus integration team. Did either one of you pick up on that or have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I recall the conversation, and they were kind of struggling with the name because I love the reference to fire wardens. That really explained it to me. That you bring people together when you need to get the job done, and then you go back to your day job, so to speak. And it's a nod to, I think, the reality that we live in some of the more complex enterprises we deal with. And the other thing about that really struck me was they emphasize looking after crossing dependencies. So we've got dependencies crossing teams. So that's kind of the trigger, or what pulls the fire alarm, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the lazy comparison to that term would be something along the lines of release management, if I wanted to be lazy. But like you said, Mike, the description used was fire warden. And if you think about some of the things that we run into when we try to scale teams across an enterprise, it typically is something around dependencies and around you have 7, 8, 9, 15 teams all trying to put code into the same environment at the same time. And while we have SAFe has the big picture and Scrum at Scale has, that fractal-based infinite scaling, there is something to be said about the elegance of having not only dirt simple but a single wrinkable neck, right? Someone who it's in their bailiwick, for lack of a better word, to control those sort of things.
I thought you were going to say integration is kind of like a fire drill. That's why they have firewall.
No, it wasn't going to go that far, but yeah, not too bad. Andrew, any particular thoughts?
I always thought the integration team was like almost like a team, like a mob scrum master group, like literally overseeing the entire kind of all of the scrum teams. But I might be misinterpreting that.
Well, it kind of is if you think about it, because it's almost like a scrum of scrums, right? Why do we do the scrum of scrums? We do it to get all the teams talking to one another. So this is almost a more permanent, to steal from Dad, enterprise aware function of the framework. But yeah, I like most of you, I knew nothing about Nexus going in, and it was really, really interesting. Before we move off Nexus, any final thoughts? Ben, Mike, Andrew?
I haven't seen.
I love the. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
No, I just was going to say I haven't seen many companies implement Nexus, so it's not something I hear talked about often in the market. But that could just be industry specific. I don't know.
How about you, Mike?
There was a quote or a saying that came up during the podcast. They were talking about having too much work in process at the portfolio level, and he said, "How many times have you lost 5 pounds?" I could kind of relate to that. I think I'm going to actually use that this coming week in some teaching I'm doing.
Yeah, I think the line was something along. Keep me honest. Was it something around chartering too much work? How organizations charter too much work and they're not realistic in their expectations. Yeah, that's another. Again, going back to that dirt simple, simplicity idea. It does make sense.
Yeah.
Ben, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the whole fire marshal thing kind of reminds me of, like it's sort of like breaking case of fire. If possible, don't use it necessarily. And that reminds me a little bit of the Scrum at Scale stuff, which is one of the key phrases there was minimal viable bureaucracy. So it's, in some ways, it almost seems to me, I don't know which came first. I think Nexus came before Scrum at Scale, but it almost seems like Scrum at Scale sort of took a lot of the same spirit of Nexus in what it did.
I think so. I think you're right. And they're both Scrum based, and I think they come, scrum.org. So it does makes a lot of sense. Moving along. So let's go on to the next episode we did in the series, which was large scale Scrum. So for this one, for those of you that don't remember, we interviewed Gene Gendel, who is a less practitioner and a less coach, less instructor. He's actually a really, really funny guy. I don't know if that came through in the recording. It took a little bit behind the scenes. It took like 3 or 4 attempts for us to finally get together. It was just a cavalcade of funny events, but I thought that was interesting to me. I had never, we've always heard Les referred to. Larman is a personality. If you've ever seen any of his videos, I know Ben has shared them with both Mike and I on YouTube. He's pretty funny. He's pretty honest in his opinions, however biting they may be on the industry. So this was an interesting one for me. I learned a lot. Curious to see what you guys thought. Because I think as both of you said, you had a little bit of experience with Les. So Ben, I'll start with you. What did you think of the episode? What did you learn? Surprises?
Yeah, I wouldn't say a ton of surprises. I think the big surprise for me was the less huge thing, which I didn't really know about before. But I guess I'll get to that in a second. I mean, the thing that I really like about Les is that it's sort of reflected in the interview that you can almost feel that sort of Larman presence of, don't even try this unless you really mean it. It didn't try to like meet people where they're at, or there's a huge organizational design component to this that I don't think is necessarily, complicated or difficult from like a mapping standpoint, but more from like a, are you going to actually commit to doing this and restructuring yourself in a certain way, whether it be product owner consolidation or product backlog consolidation, or, really forcing your teams from component team to feature team. I think those things are sort of kind of hard line underpinnings of less, which I think is really interesting and forces learning into what you do, and that based on that you essentially make everything more agile. But the whole less huge thing threw me off a little bit for sure, because I thought that went a little bit against the whole idea of moving to one product owner, one product backlog. To hear that that it kind of tops out at about 8. I mean, I guess it depends on the person or whoever, but to hear that there's a bit of a limit to that, that definitely threw me off a little bit and didn't seem quite so absolute, and sort of that conviction of consolidating everything, and making your product complex, so or as wide breadth as possible. So it definitely threw me off a little bit, and I've heard some people who are really into safe get kind of upset about less, because or any of these really, and they'll say they're just copying safe, and I don't agree with that necessarily, but at the same time, hearing about less huge did kind of get those wheels turning in my mind of actually, is this sort of when it tops out at 8 teams or so, is that sort of similar to the size of an agile release train? So I don't know. Those are just some things that were going through my head that threw me off a little bit when it came to the kind of hard line, organizational design things that they talk about.
Before I get to you, Mike, it's funny, Ben, you brought up the less huge, because I'm looking through my notes, and I do have a plus. It says +1, less huge, future episode, ? And that was one of those things where, as it came out, I don't think I knew enough at that point to go down that rabbit hole, which true ignorance here, I will confess. There are a couple of instances where I don't feel like I poked as much as I could have, because I wasn't as sure as I am now. But you're right, that definitely is something that gives one pause, especially when we talk about Larman and the whole one product owner to rule them all, and some of his logic behind that. It does sort of seem like it's almost not contradictory, but almost just a little bit to the left of what we were expecting.
Yeah, it almost makes you want to go back and say, wait, hold on, I just need a bit more clarification on the difference. And that, to me, there's sort of, I don't know if now is the best time to bring it up, but there's a big commonality in all these that sort of, they're all branded different ways, but they're all kind of there's these moments of kind of when you scale, or what are these sort of critical thresholds of number of people or number of teams or whatever, that are quite similar kind of across the board. I'm not saying they're exact, but I don't know if any of you have read the book Sapiens. It's one of many books that I haven't finished yet, but in that they talk about how different, how humans kind of move, human clusters or whatever kind of scale differently. And first you've got your sort of family or clan unit, and that's probably roughly the size of like a perfect team in these agile frameworks. And then beyond that, it kind of tops out at somewhere around Dunbar's number, like 100 or 150. And that's sort of, in Sapiens, they say that's the max number you can really intimately gossip with. And then, to go beyond that, it's more about storytelling and all the rest of it. So, but each sort of layer you go up, it all kind of degrades a little bit. And I don't know, there's got to be something there when it comes to all these scaling frameworks and sort of the patterns that you see in terms of how and when they actually choose to kind of go up a level. So that's what I was thinking about when it came to less huge.
And that's a point, Ben, I do want to come back to that, the idea of, how the fidelity degrades as you go up and up and as you get bigger and bigger. That may actually be, if we wanted to do a root cause analysis of some of the scaling failures we've seen, or some of the failed transformations some of us have been heard of through the rumor mill or actually been part of, that may be a culprit waiting in the wings. But more to that soon. I want to get to Mike. Mike, what are your thoughts on large-scale Scrum?
Large-scale Scrum, okay. So in one place I worked, we were using the essence of less, but it was kind of undercover because of politics. Things that jumped out at me from that episode was the single PO for multiple teams. That I had to really stop and think about that and scratch my head a little, and I thought, well, maybe something to that. I love the perspective of get the debris out of the way, because so many times I've seen that debris really take a toll on trying to make forward progress with with improving our delivery. And I think you may have commented on this in the episode, Jay. I love the analogy of sushi agile. I thought that was brilliant. He makes the point about needing a burning platform. That really resonated for me, and something I've fighting in a current battle is Scrum Masters getting trivialized, and that was something that I think really resonated for me. Is that a good Scrum Master who really knows his or her craft is key to making this work. The thing that was, I guess, a little bit of a surprise, but it shouldn't have been, was the fact that the less folks are willing to say we won't be widely adopted, and that's okay. I like that. They're going for quality, not quantity.
Right. There's an almost intellectual honesty with Matt's statement, right? It's not about market share or penetration or, churning out practitioners. It's really finding the right. That's the thing that I took away from the conversation with Gene. One of the notes I had here was finding the right opportunities to use the tool and then using it.
Yeah. It makes it feel more genuine and authentic, and like those people kind of sort of maybe care about your people and your organization, and they're not there just to sell you some services.
Right.
That's how it felt to me.
Right. And again, going back to Larman on YouTube, if you watch some of his videos, that's the same opinion that a lot of us come away with. How about you, Drew? I know you said you have a little bit of experience with Les. What'd you think?
Yeah, I've seen Larman. I've talked to Larman a handful of times, so it was interesting to hear someone else describe it for me. But I'm dying to see this less implemented or in its natural habitat actually working. I'm just fascinated by it because it literally talk about taking away all the complications by literally launching a nuclear weapon into a company and just eliminating every position except for a handful. To me, would be change management in its pure unicorn form. So it just, to me, is fascinating. So yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was I think that was one of the quotes that Gene had, which was the whole job security versus role security.
Yeah.
Which I thought is a very fascinating way to look at some of the transformations we go through, where you have a lot of people saying, well, your jobs are going to change. And for those of you that have listened to Jürgen Hesselberg and the interview I just did this week, he talks about an example in his article, in his book, where the head of HR gets up and says, look, I'm not sure where everybody's going to fit, but we're going to get there together. We're going to find roles for everyone as best as we can. I think that's a real powerful message. And like you said, Leff, it is almost a tactical nuke. To get up and say something like that at the enterprise level is not akin to heresy, but it's legit. The emperor has no clothes, and he's an idiot, and I should have his job, all in one sentence.
Yeah, but it just takes that first follower, right?
Yeah,
So.
This is true. This is true. Any other final thoughts, guys, before we move on from Les? Mike, Ben?
Yeah, I think Ben mentioned this a bit ago, but Les and Nexus and same Scrum and Scale, they strike me as making Scrum work in a certain context and trying not to get too big and not trying to solve every problem in the world. Just like doing really good Scrum and doing it in a focused context.
Ben, final thoughts?
I noticed that.
Go on.
Yeah, I was going to say that I agreed with that. What Mike just said, that one of the things I did was I sort of clustered these into groups, and it seemed like the Nexus, Scrum at Scale, Les were sort of different flavors of how do you make Scrum work for more than one team, whereas Safe and dad felt a bit more like toolboxes or libraries. And it was just kind of interesting seeing that sort of main branch split between all of them. And that's pretty cool.
Awesome. Next up we're going to go to is probably the one that the four of us are most familiar with, is Scaled Agile, aka SAFe. For this, we had Scott M. Frost, who was one of the SAFe fellows. I believe there's only between 16 or 18 in the entire world. So he's one of the people, I guess, Dean Levenwell is entrusting with the next generation of SAFe. So this was an interesting conversation because I think you could tell that a lot of us had experience. I know Andrew was on the call with me. Chris Merman was on. So we have a fair amount of experience in SAFe. So this was an almost deeper conversation. I'm going to start with you, Ben. What were your thoughts on that episode? Any observances, surprises, things you learned?
Something that was mentioned was about how SAFe was the only one that was, updated and reiterated on. I think that was later, they mentioned Scrum at Scale. It's on GitHub, and, anybody can suggest edits to it. So I guess that would count as well. But I do think it's good how they update it, and that's cool. I'm with you guys. It's the one that I have the most experience in. And I'm not crazy about that fact. It's not the one that I prefer to have the most experience in. And one of the reasons for that is something that I found quite shocking, that several people on the podcast said. Was that it's not something that's meant to be necessarily implemented in its entirety. Lock, stock, and barrel, do the whole thing all at once. Don't leave any of it out, which is something that, Mike and I have talked about this on the side, that, it's not necessarily meant to be that way, but you would think that the way people implement it, that it is supposed to be that way. But I think it's something that it's actually, if you look at it more as a toolbox or a library of stuff that you could pull from, built on, tons of experience and history of other people who have done this stuff, but not necessarily all of it, then it can be super valuable. But if you do look at it the opposite way and think that you do need to take all of it in all at the same time, I think it can be quite detrimental. So the thing that I found really refreshing about that particular podcast was having all these people who had done quite a bit of SAFe recommend that as the way to do it rather than the entire prescription.
Right, just dropping the entire big picture onto an organization. Like you said, lock, stock, not leaving anything out, no stone unturned. We might be, as practitioners, maybe some of us were our own worst enemies.
Yeah, very possible. But it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, I guess, because I would suspect that that's one of the reasons why it's so popular, is because of that big picture and kind of looking at it and seeing, like, here's the answer to every problem you might have. So it's a bit of a plus and a minus, I guess.
Very true. Very true. How about you, Mike?
The things that jumped out at me from that episode were Scott was, I think, refreshingly candid about SAFe's intent and strengths, and a couple things that kind of made my my index were the reference to wallpapering SAFe on top of an existing culture, and that was created a very vivid visual for me, having seen several instances of that kind of wallpapering. And the other thing was the comment about some organizations put blinders on and just look at SAFe. And so coming from a SAFe fellow to hear that, I was like, wow, okay, so there is in your mind, there is a world beyond beyond the framework that you work with. Was kind of hoping to hear something about Kanban through that discussion, but it didn't seem to wander there. And the emphasis on use the things that fit and don't use the things that don't fit really resonated for me. I got to give a big shout out to the folks at Scaled Agile for taking continuous improvement seriously. Right? You see it in how they are constantly evolving their body of knowledge, and the emphasis that Scaled Agile places on retrospection and adaptation. So the thing that I really took away from that is kind of reinforced the idea that the mindset and understanding why we're doing something that we may find within the Scaled Agile framework is really the key thing to keep in mind for me.
The remark about wallpaper, I actually took a note of that. I thought was you're right, it is a very good vivid picture. In a previous home that the wife and I owned, the previous owner tried to use wallpaper to cover up popcorn on one of the walls. And I think if you think about that scenario, all of us are homeowners, so we know what that potentially ends up in. Probably is a fairly good analogy to some of the attempts at transformation we've seen, where somebody comes in and prescribes SAFe, and you throw it on top of your pre-existing culture, your pre-existing ways of working, and then things go haywire, right? I saw the bumps coming through the wallpaper, and what was started stupidly by me scratching with my thumbnail trying to figure out was that a nail pop, ended up being a multi-weekend experiment where I ripped out an entire wall and had to re-sheetrock it, which I'm sure there's an analogy for an agile transformation in that second part as well.
Yeah, but yeah, the comment about the leaders should practice and breathe the cultural change. That's the key to making it work. That really resonated for me. So it kind of fits right in there.
Now, Drew, I know you were on the episode with me, so anything when you think about it, or when you went back and listened again, anything jump out at you as, oh, that was an interesting point I never thought of before?
Yeah, I can't stand listening to myself on podcasts. I mean, for me, it's how, I've made my living has been on, SAFe implementation. So a good portion of it anyway. But I teeter back and forth. I see a lot of value in it, and I also see a lot of challenge. So I think it's like like we were just talking about when it came to less. It's all how you talk about the communication plan and the change management around this change. So if the foundation isn't there, none of this works. So I think it's very similar with SAFe. SAFe just looks a lot more complicated.
Right, and I think like Ben and I were just discussing, we're worst enemies when you try to do everything at once. I think you're absolutely right. Now let's go to the next one on the agenda, Scrum at Scale. And I'm going to start with you, Mike. Any experience with this? What were your observations? What surprised you? Anything you learned?
Sure. Yeah. No experience with Scrum at Scale other than reading it. I downloaded the Scrum at Scale guide a year or so ago because it looked interesting and I wanted to learn about it. So what I learned from the episode, number one, that the guide is on GitHub, which I thought was kind of cool. The emphasis, again, on management and executive leadership, the executive action team. I've seen that name before. However, in that context, they weren't quite behaving the way she was describing the executive action team. But it really takes Scrum top to bottom through the organization. I had a little bit of a different reaction to the minimum viable bureaucracy, just because one of my personal pet peeves is people attach minimum viable to everything. And it kind of almost becomes too trite, because I wage a war against false MVPs. You hear multiple MVPs, multiple minimum viable this, minimum viable that. But I love the emphasis on getting rid of bureaucracy that doesn't need to be there, and the decision latency, bureaucracy is a disease, and the one that got me. Executives are good at creating complex solutions to simple problems. I was literally laughing out loud when I heard that.
I forgot about that one. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, it's funny because it's true. And it's as you would expect. It's Scrum at an extreme level. The fractal approach to scaling, I thought makes a lot of sense. As I was listening to that, and then it is also kind of applies to Nexus and less, maybe to similar or lesser extent. I'm curious y'all's thoughts. But if an organization's architecture enables it, it's awesome. There's some organizations with loads of technical debt in their architectures and loads of organizational debt in the way they interact. Makes it really tough to implement the concepts in Scrum at scale. That was a thought that came to mind as I was listening to that.
Yeah, that was an interesting point that Kim made. How about you, Ben?
I thought the first thing, I guess two main things. One was the EAT, which is an awesome name. The Executive Action Team. I thought that was quite interesting, but I don't know how that plays out exactly. I liked how it was sort of, the buck stops there, and any organizational impediment there who it ultimately lies with. But I wonder, and I'm not saying it has to be one or the other, but I wonder, does that actually manifest itself in kind of a, more of a less way in terms of like table flipping, or is it a bit more of like a diplomatic kind of transformation and initiative type way? I wonder what type of tone the Executive Action Team tends to take. So that's something I was quite curious about. I thought the fractal nature was cool. Like if you understand that, roughly 5 people is sort of the perfect team size, and then the perfect team of teams or scrum of scrum size is, 5 teams that all kind of converge together, and then going beyond that, it just keeps going with the same pattern over and over. It makes it really intuitive to kind of figure out how this works based on, however big or complex you need to make it. That seems very intuitive, particularly if you understand Scrum. But I'd say one of my sort of wake-up calls throughout all these was listening to the Scrum at Scale one, because that idea of the fractal growth or whatever was very appealing to me. But something I couldn't help but think was, even if it's not drawn in a pyramid shape and it's more of sort of these networked areas, it still can feel like levels, like a stratification. I could easily see something taking place where, I'm a Scrum of Scrum Master, or I'm a Scrum of Scrum of Scrum Master, or, just kind of keep going on and on and on. So I'm not saying it's bad necessarily, but I just could see something along those lines taking place. So that was
potential for misuse. Is that where you're going toward, Ben? Just because the way humans work, we would end up pyramiding it to a point where, so the potential for humans to misinterpret it and abuse it.
It's drawn differently than the safe big picture, but at the end of the day, maybe we'd interpret it somewhat similarly. I guess that's what I mean.
No, fair enough. How about you, Drew?
Yeah, it's funny. I learned that I was doing this maybe 10 years ago during a transformation, not quite, in this form. And we called it, I don't even remember. It was something crazy, but it was very similar. So it was very interesting to me to hear. And I've seen this work, not quite the way that they have it structured, but Scrum at scale. So I've seen that, where those, smaller teams with management and Scrum of Scrums and, whatever else has been, has worked. So it's interesting. I found it, I was like, wow, I was ahead of my time. I should have
written a book.
Capitalized on that.
What all of you said, the thing that jumped out at me was that whole enterprise action team, right? Because the idea of forcing leadership to drink their own champagne and to do the same things in the same manner as the delivery teams, there is an appeal to our baser nature, I guess, because it makes, to me, it's like, oh, okay, well, there's skin in the game. They're in the same trench as me. It's kind of sort of the one thing I get confused with, though, is Going back to, and only because it's fresh in my memory, when I talked to Jürgen Hesselberg, the idea of the Agile Working Group, right? So that this is the group tasked with removing impediments to the enterprise. And that idea, it's not necessarily comprised of executives. It's comprised of people who are willing to clear impediments for the group and that will eventually move on. So there's an interesting juxtaposition there that maybe that's something, I get Kim and Jürgen back on the call, we hash it out, but I think there is something there with empowering leadership to see that they have some role to play in the actual successful transformation of the organization, as opposed to just, I'm sure what a lot of us see, it gets ferreted out to the coaches and the practitioners. Then you get, your wrist slap when you're not making fast enough pace. Final thoughts? Scrum and Scale? All right. That sounds like it was a good one. So now we'll take us to the last episode that we released, and the last episode that I recorded, which was with Mark Lyons, one of the creators of Discipline Agile. This is the one that I personally was the most familiar with because I had taken a course. I've read all their books. It was tough to line up Mark because I didn't realize how much traveling he actually did. I think he actually talks about it in the interview. He does something like 180,000 miles in the air per year, which is pretty nuts. But it was, for me, this was very, very eye-opening because we start off with how it's not a scaling framework. It's just a framework. So I'm going to start with you, Ben. Well, what were your thoughts on the Discipline Agile episode? What did you learn? What intrigued you? What jumped out at you?
Yeah, I didn't really know much about DAD at all. I spoke about it a little bit with you, and you sent over some materials, and they are kind of intimidating to look at. It's sort of, I don't know if a big giant decision tree is an applicable thing to compare it to, but it's a little bit intimidating. And I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons why it's maybe not as popular as some of the other ones. Because from a conceptual standpoint, I'm personally really into it. I love the idea. They kept referring to it as a toolkit. And to me, that's really key is having something that is just openly acknowledged as it's a toolkit. Other people have done this stuff before. This is what's worked in these situations. Give this stuff a try. I think that's just awesome. So I am wondering, that's sort of my theory is that, maybe it's just it doesn't have the best marketing and maybe it's a little bit intimidating to look at. But I am kind of quite curious as to why it's not quite as popular as, SAFe, for example, or maybe some of the others. But I think, having that toolkit as opposed to an exact how-to prescriptive thing is quite key. So I basically think it should be more popular than it is.
Right. And I would agree with that statement because I know you and I have shared the same observances. And then I think Mark actually said in the interview at one point, maybe we should have done a little bit more in the marketing piece because they truly are onto something unique. How about you, Mike? What are your thoughts?
Things that really resonated for me, similar to Ben, is that he positioned it and communicated as more of a toolkit than a framework, and that it can be a complement to, not a replacement for other methods. So it's not like you have to use the DAD framework or you can't use Scaled Agile or whatever. I love the augment and amplify vibe that they had going, and the reference to Ivar Jakobsen and the methods prison line of thinking, that really resonated to me because as I listen to this series and think about it, and there's so much commonality amongst them that it's like kind of where Ivar Jakobsen's thoughts are going is we're imprisoned by these gurus and this branded or weaponized terms, and there's a lot of commonality amongst them. And Dad seemed to hew more towards providing stuff that's worked pretty well in places and encouraging you to use what works for you and to self-select your method as opposed to some central authority or center telling you which method you're supposed to use. The other thing, I love the connection to the Dan Pink Drive body of knowledge, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That really resonated for me. And Ben, as you were talking, you triggered a thought in my mind. I wonder if Discipline Agile is not as popular because it's not a recipe book almost. It forces you to think and take ownership of your decisions. So that can be daunting if you're not comfortable in the domain that you're going into. And lastly, the emphasis on, be awesome. One of the things I tell teams and groups when I first start to work with them is my wish for you is that I help you figure out ways to be more awesome at what you do. So that really resonated for me. And the certification scheme, it's having some experience required component to it made a lot of sense. And I could relate, because been in this business that long, to the 15, 20 years ago when the PMP cert came out. It meant a lot of time because you had to really work to get it. Now, notwithstanding, what we think now about that particular certification, but I thought, they're kind of onto something there.
Yeah, there's a lot, and I took away from the conversation, Mark, there's a lot of ideas that they had almost bubbling below the surface that one could pick a random assortment of them and dive in deep and really end up with some really fascinating stuff coming out the other end. I want to get to Andrew first. I don't want to come back to the whole maturity model conversation that Mark and I had, which I actually didn't have that epiphany till right before we started. But first, Drew, you said you dabbled a little bit in Discipline Agile. What were your thoughts? What did you learn? What did you think of the conversation?
No, I mean, I enjoyed it. I've talked to Lyons before. Really well-spoken, good guy. Excuse me. And the dad stuff's just, again, I want to echo the comments that have already been stated. So I really like the toolkit mentality. I really like I thought at one point he referred to it as a hybrid, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, it was a hybrid of complements your delivery, a hybrid of practices was his exact words.
Yeah, and I think that term is misused a lot, but I really like the way that he used it, right? The hybrid whole thing could be a whole other podcast in itself. So I just enjoyed it. I really liked to hear his point of view. I would like to see more of these frameworks in action. I guess that's, I keep using that as a theme, but DAD is another one where I've seen it discussed from a strategic level, but I've never seen it in action.
Yeah, I think that goes without saying. A lot of these, we would love to be flies on the wall to see them actually working in nature. The maturity part that we talked about, I didn't have that epiphany till legitimately probably an hour before Mark and I sat down to talk, because I was rereading through the book and my coursework to refresh myself, and I noticed how they get a lot of flack for having the concept of an inception phase, a construction phase, and a transition phase. But then as you read through the book, it talks about how those, and Mark even talked about how the inception and transition phases get smaller and smaller and smaller as you get more mature. So I think Ben and I were passing an article back and forth about you don't need a maturity framework or agile maturity, the next consultant vaporware, check printing machine. And if you think about it, if that's the big thing that everybody's worried about, and everybody's running around building these models and matrices to create maturity, well, Discipline Agile, just by fact of taking it on its surface in a purely academic nature, you're actually building in your maturity, which I thought was really neat. And it really spun me out. I was off in a rabbit hole when I was doing yard work later that week, just thinking about, there's a couple of options there. Any final thoughts on Dad, Ben, Mike, Drew?
No, I like what you said.
Go for it.
I'll be quiet.
I just wanted to add that his point about maybe they need to do a little different marketing approach kind of resonated with me, because I was significantly enlightened by what I learned from listening to that episode. And I think using terms that are familiar to those that may have endured RUP and endured RUP in a unfortunate form, maybe creating some PTSD-like reactions. I think there's a lot of potential there with a little bit better marketing.
You mentioned Rupp and Ivor Jacobson, and I actually threw out after this interview, and I read the Methods Prison article, and my mind was blown because it makes a lot of sense. I reached out to a mutual friend of ours, and it was in the guise of a group chat. I said, "Does anybody have any connections to Ivor Jacobson?" And the response was something along the lines of, "The Rupp guy, I did that. I almost had a breakdown. I quit. I had all this documentation, and I had nothing to show for it." And I think it's funny that in the Methods Prison article, he actually talks about how it was the worst idea ever created by man, or he makes some sort of reference like that. I thought that was rather funny, but rather honest and open to be self-reflective like that in an honest way. Just because you created it doesn't mean you have to think it's perfect. What were you going to say, Drew?
No. I think I was just going to echo what you were talking about the maturity model and so forth. So I can appreciate that. I can also appreciate the certification track as far as needing experience and so forth. So.
And lastly, how about you, Ben?
No, I'm good with Dad for now.
Okay. So now that we've talked about all the different episodes and all the different conversations that we've had, we've rehashed them, we pointed out things that we remember. Now let's take it almost a step further and go up a level. So, I'm going to start off with a question, which is not going to be controversial because it just is the fact. If you look at the last State of Agile report that came out from version 1, SAFe is obviously the most utilized scaling framework. Something along in the mid-20, 23, 25, 26% of respondents said they're using that as a scaling framework. After comparing and hearing the comparisons, why do you think that's such, that SAFe is the big dog in the pond? And I'm going to start with you. Let's start with Ben.
I think a lot of it has to do with that big picture again, and sort of in somewhat easy mapping from here to there. I think if you look at like Scrum at scale and you see the fractal nature of it, and you're kind of like, well, that's not how things look right now. And then with less, with that sort of hard line, you need the org restructuring. You need to change the way your teams are composed. You need to change your whole product structure. I think it's more intimidating, and it's sort of like it can at least feel like a bigger first step. Whereas I think SAFe has a lot of marketing, it's got the big picture, and it's got a whole lot of training to come alongside with it that says, we're going to train you through all of this as well. So I think that perfect storm of all that, and I'm sure there's some other things too, kind of lead it to feeling like a very safe thing to do. And I think the name, whether on purpose or by accident, contributes to that feeling.
Very true. Very true. Mike?
I think a couple of thoughts. The SAFe Scaled Agile Framework is trying to address a really thorny problem, and bringing agility to large, siloed, dysfunctional organizations. I don't say that with malice. It's just kind of the space that SAFe tends to play in. So Scaled Agile covers a lot of ground. It has something for everyone, and as Ben pointed out, it's easier to map current roles and governance structures, even uses some similar lingo. So I think that makes it accessible and appealing, and there's a pretty good partner network. There's a lot of people with SAFe certifications. Where I think it gets a bit of a bad rap is because it's the dark side of meet them where they're at. That organizations kind of get comfortable, and people get comfortable without necessarily incurring the pain of change that some of the other frameworks really kind of force your hand to confront. So in some of the less robust, safe instances. People will declare victory. Yay, we're doing safe, we're agile, yay. But they haven't really confronted the hard changes. And I don't think that's what Dean and the folks at SAI really envisioned, but it kind of happens. And they also play the shirts and certs game extremely well.
Yeah. I think there's something like 500,000 plus globally safe certified practitioners in some level, anywhere from a safe scrum master all the way up to an SPC. So I think volumetrically that's probably going to lend itself to more exposure. I think you both have touched on that. How about you, Drew? What are your thoughts?
I think it's because it looks the most like waterfall. So I
Yeah.
think companies, they see it. It looks complicated, but somewhat familiar because of all the layers and kind of how it goes top down. Depending upon what version you go with, there's still much that, top down waterfall type mentality. Not that I'm saying safe as waterfall. But it looks, from what I've understood and being parts of those conversations with various organizations, they just gravitate towards it. There's some enchantment about, wow, this kind of looks the way we do things now. This looks like it'll fit the best.
I think I would concur with that. It's very easy to put that big picture in front of the mahogany row and have someone see that picture and say, okay, well, I could put Mike here, I could put Ben here, I put Drew here, I put Jay here. Okay, so now this is working, it's working. And I think Mike, you might have made this remark. It's people go with that, like Drew said, it's close to waterfall because it excuses them from having to make some of those really tough transformative decisions that some of the other frameworks would request of you. Stuff like LESS, stuff like Scrum at Scale, where it's scaling but going the other way and descaling. I think that was you, right, Mike, that made the remark?
Yeah.
So that's probably another reason why it's the fear of change. And then Drew and I talk about this all the time. The fear of change, the uphill battle that people don't want to fight. Safe maybe sort of helps them mentally gird themselves from that. How about you, Ben? What are your thoughts?
On safe?
On why do you think safe is the big dog in the yard? What do you think? Why does that seem to be the most popular and most chosen framework when it comes comparatively to all the rest of them?
Oh, I already answered this one.
Oh shit!
I can.
I'll let it in post.
That's all right. I can talk a little bit about because on the follow up in terms of what others could do to compete or which other ones might be the biggest competition.
Yeah, that was one of the questions after. So yeah, let's talk about that. What do you think is going to be the biggest competition? What do you think some of the other frameworks could do to get themselves parity?
So I'm actually going to kind of punt on this question, and because I actually don't think any of them are really the answer. Like I actually kind of think if it comes to a quote unquote scaling framework, that whatever's going to be the top dog, I think it's going to remain safe, just because it's already got that kind of critical mass, I guess apex predator, as Snowden would call it, kind of presence out there. But I also think there's sort of a shift. And I think it's kind of too bad because I think there's a lot of good stuff in all the stuff that was covered in this series. But I think something that you tend to see or hear about is that a lot of the companies that we think of as, the top tech companies, a lot of them sort of seem to brag that they're kind of quote unquote beyond agile, which obviously they're not. They're extremely agile, but they're sort of beyond, the branded version of agile or the framework or method prison or whatever. They're kind of like beyond that part of it. And they're treating everything like a toolbox. And I actually think that that's sort of like, that's probably where things are headed most next is in terms of not necessarily which framework is going to sit on the Iron Throne, so to speak, but which framework is, or which elements of which frameworks are going to prove to be sort of most universally successful out there as people kind of create their own little customized mishmashes of these things.
Good call out, Ben, on the whole idea of being post-agile, because you're right. There are a lot of people a lot of organizations who want to skew away from that purposeful application of a label. And if I'm going to give a shout out, I'm going to give a shout out back to one of our very, very, very early episodes. We had a discussion on meta frameworks, which is the combination, which I think is where you were going, Ben, is treating everything like a toolbox and pulling pieces from here or there. Because, I mean, quite honestly, when I look at some of the transformations I've been through, I see where we could have used Discipline Agile to help jumpstart some of the things we were doing. I think the less monster regarding scaling down and more centralized product ownership, I think, could have been helpful. The enterprise, the executive agile team, the enterprise action team, I think that's a really helpful idea. I really do think, my personal opinion is the future is going to be some sort of portmanteau of all these, where the practitioners that know how to pull from different fields are the ones that are going to be most successful. I just want to throw a scenario question out there, and then we'll wrap it up because I know we're quickly approaching time. In your previous lives, we've all been through multiple transformations. Can you think of an example where, given what you know now after going through this podcast series, can you think of an example? And Mike, I'm going to start with you. Can you think of an example where you've been through a transformation using a particular framework that, in hindsight, you might have been suited for a different one? And if so, I don't want to go into the client, or I want to go into what they chose, but I would be curious to, if you have an example where I should have used dad because of X, Y, Z. Do you have any scenario like that sitting in your mind?
Yeah, sure. One particular instance I can think of, the group that was 5 to 6 teams. They were relatively independent. The only commonality was they were in the same general subject matter part of the organization, and they had reporting lines up through similar management structure. And they were formed into an agile release train in a safe context. And what they really needed was something like Scrum at scale, because they didn't have it wasn't a single product, but they really didn't need much more than to occasionally coordinate. So in that context, I was told, we're using safe, use safe, and that's the end of the discussion. So I think in that context, knowing what I know now, I've probably advocated a little harder to maybe try a little different approach.
Perfect. Ben, any scenario yourself?
Yeah, I'm not thinking of a specific scenario, but I'd say, a lot that I've been in have been, I guess I won't get too specific, but it could be Scrum, could be safe, could be whatever, where it's sort of the edict from on high that that's the direction that we're going. But I think it's always just a bit of an awkward footing to start out on, because then it's sort of, as a coach, you're coming in, it's kind of like, who are you with? Who are you, like, are you here to make us do stuff, or what? What's your deal? And so that was the thing I was actually thinking, disciplined agile, because something that I remember being mentioned was how it's got sort of that underlying principle or slogan or whatever of Kanban, which is, come as you are. And I think engaging with people on those terms at first is like, it really just lines up with the whole idea of invitation over imposition and, consensual coaching and all that. So I think having that, and it's sort of like, I've got this huge body of knowledge and different choices here that we can work from. But we're going to figure it out together and see what works for our context. And I think that's a really valuable thing. So I wish I knew about disciplined agile in the past, and the philosophical underpinning that it provides.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. How about you, Drew? Take us home.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good example. I think for me, it was just, coming in as a consultant, it's already chosen. So a lot of times I don't, it's just kind of, figure this out, even though, you're just supporting the lie. But yeah, so I don't have a concrete example. I would like to do things a lot differently most of the time. So, but fortunately or unfortunately, it's not about me.
This is probably leading into another episode we could probably do with the same group of people. All three of you have mentioned how there's been times where you've wanted to do something different. Maybe you've been a little hamstrung. Decision was made from on high. How to sort of combat that type of scenario, because my example was I have a transformation I went through where we decided we were going to use SAFe, not to start, but that's where management wanted to go. And in hindsight, and even talking to people who are still at the organization, who are still going through those transformation works, I think probably SAFe was a little bit more than they needed. I think they could have gotten away with it. It's almost like Mike's example. They maybe could have gotten away with the Scrum at scale. They probably even could have gotten a little crazy with it and used large-scale Scrum. I think that probably would have been the even better fit because there wasn't a large breadth of products. So that makes a lot more sense to have those teams all sharing the same product owner. Again, Discipline Agile, I just think that transcends. It's not even a scaling framework. It's just a toolbox of tons of stuff in there. And I have actually used some of the stuff. I think I talked about it in the episode. I used it to help define the MVP for standing up a new team. So it's pretty fascinating. Well, I think we're almost an hour in, and I'm sorry for taking up everybody's time. So I'm going to go around the horn real quick. Any final thoughts? And if people want to engage in the conversation, say somebody doesn't like Ben, they didn't like what you had to say, and they want to pick and fight with you, where can they find you? Twitter, LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to start with Mike. So, Mike, final thoughts, and where can people find you if they want to continue the conversation?
So, final thought is be awesome and just stay agile, my friends. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. And for the month of June, you'll probably find me in the airport more than at home.
Oh, the life of a consultant. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I didn't know you were on Twitter, Mike. I'm off Twitter now. I'm just on LinkedIn. I used to use Twitter, but I wasn't getting much out of it at the time, so I'm off it now, unfortunately. Maybe I'll get back on. My final thought is actually kind of a question, really, that I'm still wondering after all of this, is that all of these scaling frameworks seem to sort of, embrace scale. And so it's something that you touched on, Jay, a few times in terms of, scaling doesn't necessarily mean up. It could mean scaling down. And every time I hear people talk about scaling agile or most things, really, I think of that Princess Bride quote where they say, inconceivable. And then, like I said, I don't think that word means what you think it means. And that's how I feel about scaling overall. And what I sort of wonder is, all these frameworks seem to kind of embrace the complication of various products and sort of the need for dependency and the need for coordination. But I didn't really, it's sort of like, how do you do that in an agile way? But I didn't see a ton of kind of breaking things down almost so that every team is its own individual value stream, like kind of changing the question to, how do we just eliminate all that rather than manage it? And I think there was like some flavor of it, but not necessarily, as much as I was expecting to see. So I'm wondering, is there just not really a true answer to that question, or is it something that I missed in the frameworks or what? But kind of, thinking, how do you change the game rather than, play the game by a different set of rules or whatever? So.
That's a great point, and I think I'm going to make you bring that back in a future episode, because I think we can really unpack that. The idea of the complexity just being inherent, and how do we actually deal with that? Awesome, thank you, Ben. And last but not least, Drew.
Yeah, no, you can always find me on the usual spots, the Coalition, and out on Twitter at Lean Leff. But I also just want to give a big shout out to Jay, our host, for putting this series together. He knocked it out of the park with this. It was a lot of work. So greatly appreciate all the time and effort that you've put forth on this. It's a great body of work, man.
Thanks. And I'm glad,
well done, Jay.
I'm glad you guys all enjoyed it.
Jay.
It really was truly a labor of love. The reschedules, the missed conversations, I think the only person I got first time on the phone out of the gate was Scott Frost, and that's only because Chris Merman works with him, and you do, Drew. And then the Nexus folks, I got them right out the bat. But I know Kim had a snowstorm, Mark had to travel, Gene had some stuff going on with the previous engagement. I'm hoping that there are other listeners who enjoyed this as much because it really was fun. So with that, I will take it home. On behalf of Drew and myself, I want to thank you, Ben. I want to thank you, Mike, for taking time out of your busy evenings to sit and have this conversation with us. On behalf of the four of us, I want to thank all of our listeners for taking the time to listen and join in. If you like what you heard, you want to further the conversation, there will be a thread of this eventually on the Coalition. We know, hopefully by the time this episode comes out, we have the DNS repointed and it's working again. If not, we just spun up a Discord server, which is for more real-time type communication and conversation. We have a decent amount of people joining in the conversation there, so feel free to jump in. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank your listeners for tuning in. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising Podcast signing out.